I'm 76 now, and most mornings I wake up with the same quiet thought, the one that sits on my chest before my feet ever touch the floor, reminding me that the choice I made at 66 did not fade with time the way I once believed all difficult things eventually would. I live alone in a house that feels larger every year, and I have learned that age does not soften certain memories. It sharpens them, stripping away excuses and leaving only what actually happened and what I told myself while it was happening. When people hear my story, they often assume it began with recklessness or arrogance, but that is not how it felt from the inside, because at the time I believed I was making a careful, even thoughtful decision, one that I told myself was honest instead of cowardly. 10 years feels like a long time until you realize it is not enough to forget the sound of a familiar voice or the way someone used to stand in a doorway, waiting for you to finish whatever you thought mattered more in that moment. Before all of this, I had what most would call a stable life, the kind built slowly and without much drama, the kind that does not impress strangers but tends to hold up through decades if you do not tamper with it too much. I was married for over 40 years to a woman who knew the rhythm of my days better than I did myself, who could tell by the way I set my keys down whether I was tired or troubled, even when I insisted I was fine. Our marriage was not passionate in the cinematic sense, but it was steady, filled with routines that felt unremarkable while I lived inside them and now feel impossible to replace. Like Sunday mornings spent reading separate sections of the same newspaper at the same table, I worked long hours, built a business that did well, and learned to measure my worth in productivity and outcomes, telling myself that providing stability was the same thing as being present, and that appreciation would arrive later, when things finally slowed down. She never demanded much from me, which I now understand was both her strength and her quiet mistake, because I interpreted her patience as contentment and her silence as agreement. When I met the young woman, I did not see danger or betrayal. I saw admiration, pure and uncomplicated, the kind that looks at you as though you are finished becoming yourself and already worthy of attention. She was 23 and she asked me questions no one had asked me in years, not because they were profound, but because she seemed genuinely interested in the answers, and that attention settled into me in a way I was unprepared to examine honestly. I told myself it was harmless at first, that enjoying being seen was not the same as wanting to be wanted, and that after decades of responsibility, it was natural to enjoy the feeling of being impressive again. At home, my wife listened to me with the familiarity of someone who had heard the stories before, who did not need them to prove anything, and I mistook that ease for indifference, without considering that comfort is often the reward of long attention. I began to feel restless without understanding why, noticing small things I had ignored for years, the predictability of our evenings, the way conversations rarely surprised me anymore, and instead of asking what that restlessness meant, I blamed the marriage for no longer exciting me. The admiration I received felt like oxygen, and I convinced myself that love was supposed to feel like that, bright and energizing rather than quiet and reliable, even though I had once believed the opposite when I was younger. When I finally admitted the relationship to myself, I framed it as honesty rather than betrayal, telling myself that staying would be the greater lie, that choosing what felt alive was a kind of courage rather than a failure of responsibility. I remember the night I told my wife, sitting across from her at the same table where we had eaten thousands of meals, watching her absorb my words with a stillness that frightened me more than anger ever could have. She did not raise her voice, did not beg or accuse. She simply asked me if I was certain, and when I said I thought I was, she nodded slowly, as if storing that moment somewhere she knew she would return to alone. Leaving the house felt surreal, like stepping out of a life that continued without me the moment I closed the door, and for a while I mistook the lightness I felt for relief rather than shock. The early months with the young woman were exactly what I had imagined, filled with laughter, attention, and the intoxicating feeling of being needed in a way that felt urgent rather than assumed. She admired my stories, my experience, my decisiveness, and I enjoyed being cast as someone interesting rather than dependable, even as I avoided thinking about what that difference meant. But admiration is fragile, and it depends on distance, and as the novelty faded, so did the certainty I thought I had found, replaced by a subtle imbalance I did not know how to name. She was still becoming herself while I was finished, and over time that gap stopped feeling flattering and started feeling lonely, as though we were speaking adjacent languages that only overlapped occasionally. I noticed how often she looked at her phone, how conversations circled different priorities, how my presence became less essential as her world expanded, and I realized too late that admiration does not age well. When she eventually left, it was without cruelty, simply a recognition that her life was moving in directions mine could not follow, and I was left holding a decision I could no longer share with anyone. The divorce finalized quietly, efficiently, like the closing of an account, and I did not attend my wife's new apartment or see how she arranged her furniture, because by then I had convinced myself that distance was kindness. Years passed, marked by professional achievements that felt increasingly hollow, dinners eaten alone, and the slow realization that the future I imagined was no longer waiting for me. The moment that clarified everything did not arrive dramatically, but in the form of a phone call informing me that my former wife had passed away after a brief illness, a call that left me standing in my kitchen, unable to sit or speak. There was no opportunity for reconciliation, no final conversation to correct my assumptions or apologize for my blindness, only the sudden understanding that the past had closed without my consent. At the service, I sat among people who had known her in ways I no longer could, listening to stories that revealed parts of her life that continued after I left, and I realized how thoroughly I had removed myself from a shared history. What I lost was not just a marriage, but the witness to my life, the person who remembered who I was before success hardened me, before admiration confused me into believing it was something deeper. Time does not offer refunds, and there is no path back to the moment before you decide to leave, only a narrowing road that eventually ends, whether you are ready or not. Now, when I speak to you, it is not to warn or instruct, but to share what I did not understand until it was too late, that admiration feels like movement, but love feels like staying. I wish I had known that comfort is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of trust built over years, and that excitement is a poor measure of what will remain when novelty fades. I do not have many years left, and I spend them quietly, sorting through memories that arrive without invitation, learning to accept that some mistakes are not meant to be repaired, only understood. If there is any peace in this, it is the honesty I now allow myself, speaking without the expectation that clarity will change anything, only that it might settle something inside me before the end. I carry gratitude alongside regret for having loved and been loved, even imperfectly, and sorrow for confusing being admired with being known. This is where my story rests, not in resolution, but in acceptance, and in the quiet understanding that some lessons arrive only when there is no time left to use them.